Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. So we've got Tomas from DreamLabs again to talk about conducting user testing sessions for mobile apps. And obviously, that's a really super important part for when you're developing a mobile product. And I think particularly from Bravo's side, the sort of helping people experiment and test with mobile is one of our key features because we can iterate so quickly with it. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tomas to start the session.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks so much, Toby. Great. Quick intro. Myself and John, co-founders of DreamLabs. So we're a California-based fractional product team, helping teams build and launch and then iterate on their digital product visions using no-code and low-code tools. Because of the work that we do, one of the things that we've very frequently found is that, especially when first-time teams or founders are launching their first app, there's a lot of excitement and definitely an understandable kind of anticipation with the first version of the app being launched. And sometimes there's an expectation that everything should be going perfect, and also that once it's launched, the work is done, because you spend so much time thinking about the product and building it, and then once you put it out, you're like, great, now it's out in the world. I can just sit back and relax. Effectively, why we wanted to really have this conversation is to really address that and name the reality, which is that once you launch your first release for your first product, the journey has not ended. In fact, the journey is really just beginning. And the real purpose, from our perspective, of an initial launch is not to be sitting back and saying like, okay, my perfect product is out in the world. Instead, the real value of your initial launch, or even initial launches for your first releases, the real value is in what you can learn from your users with that release out in the world, in their hands, on the table. That's a pretty well understood concept. Like, you got to learn from your users and talk to your users and get feedback from your users. And that's definitely not anything unusual. But how exactly do you speak to users? What questions in particular do you ask? Which users even should you be focusing your time on speaking with? All of those questions, the tactical questions, are what we want to be covering today. So effectively, for today's conversation, we want to get into the specifics of how actually to learn from your users once you have a release that's out in the world that people can download and start using. And this conversation is really going to be based off of a pretty detailed guide that we've created and use with all of our clients, all of the startups that we partner with after we ship their initial releases, provide support on this user testing process. So this is kind of a cycle that we've run a number of times and have been able to learn and kind of tighten through that experience. So hopefully, folks find this information useful. At the end, we'll also share a link of where you can get the actual guide itself, if that those tactics and specifics are going to be relevant. So I go ahead and share my screen now. Alrighty. And kind of just walk us through basics of user testing. Because as I was mentioning, the broader kind of idea of getting feedback from your users, really great idea. But in terms of the specifics, how exactly do you do that? Well, there are a number of ways to go about it. So we're going to talk about one specific type of usability test over the course of this conversation. And that specific type is focusing on tests that are moderated, remote, and are assessment focused. There are other types of usability tests that you can do. You can run unmoderated tests. You can run remote. You can run in person. Instead of assessment, you can run comparison. You can run more ideation focused. But for this purpose, we're going to be focusing on tests that are moderated, remote, and assessment focused. And really who that is for is teams that are maybe 1 to 5 people that are in their initial, like, let's say 1 to 10 releases. So before you have 10,000 users, 100,000 users, before you have a full in-house UX team, how exactly do you go about getting started with your user testing? This is really the structure and the process that we run to do just that. And what is it for ultimately? So from our perspective, what this specific framework that we run is for determining if end users can or cannot actually do what they're supposed to do within an existing release. That's kind of the main focus. You spend a lot of time with all of these assumptions, building something, and then you want to test, well, can users actually do the thing that they're supposed to do with what you built? And what this framework is not for is for validating customer demand or product market fit, or even validating willingness to pay at different target price points. There are different frameworks that you can run and processes you can run that are much more targeted on those. So we definitely want to distinguish, what this is for and what it's not, by also naming some of the additional things that you can really get to with one of these tests in really running a usability test, learning about what users can do and what they can't do. What that also allows you to learn is if you can validate your prototype or your initial version, your MVP. It allows you to find issues with complex workflows or user flows. It allows you to gather unbiased user opinions. And most importantly, allows you to unearth insights to help create a better overall user experience. Because if you see patterns of what users can very easily do, and more importantly, what they very easily cannot do, those patterns are kind of the raw material that gives you the information to then make decisions on how to improve your product in future releases. So there's definitely, all of these aspects are kind of byproducts of running these tests, and these are all very valid uses of this information. So kind of the output of the tests. But in terms of the overall process, the way that we run them, really high level. So getting now into the tactics is over the course of 3 different phases. So when you're running a usability test, you want to start with your preparation. Second step is to actually run the test itself. Third step is then to analyze the results. So we're going to walk through each of those 3 in turn, and again, get really specific in terms of how exactly to do each of these things, so that after the end of this conversation, you can feel comfortable to say, like, okay, now I know how to run this myself. Let's go, get these test sessions started and running. So in terms of that first phase of the work in preparing for your test, where we always start is just by confirming logistics. So that's as tactical as where will the test take place? Is it going to be in person? Is it going to be online? The way that we do all of our assessments is on Google Hangout. Zoom is also totally fine. So if you're going to be doing them online, then you can ask users to share their screens so you can see exactly what they're doing. If you're going to be doing tests in person, then you can just look and see exactly what they're doing. But you definitely want to determine first, where is the test going to take place, and also time frame. How long is it going to run? Our recommendation is that you should really keep the test between 30 to 45 minutes of actual testing. So if you give some buffer before and after, that can be anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour for the actual test itself in terms of time blocking. And then you also want to determine moderator versus note taker assignments. We always recommend to have at least 2 people, and ideally, in fact, 2 people supporting each session, one focused on moderating and running the test itself, and then the other focused on active note taking. Obviously, you can record the session and then take notes in more detail of the recording afterwards. We find it really helpful to have those 2 folks, so those 2 roles defined for each session. And then you can also determine things like compensation. So do you want to offer compensation to your participants based off of the time that they're giving you? And there's no right way to go about that. But our recommendation is, as much as possible, try not to, just because we want to keep the kind of context and the framing of the conversation of the testing session really as kind of direct as possible. And you don't want to be, or putting money on the table can sometimes like slightly skew the perspective where the user's like, oh, I'm getting paid, so I need to give them what they want to hear, as opposed to sharing actually what they think. So no right way to go about it, but that's our rule of thumb. But once you have those logistics defined, then it's time to focus on getting your actual test participants themselves. There's no, again, hard and fast rule of how many participants you need to get. The rule of thumb that we operate on, however, is for every release, we schedule about 5 individual sessions. So that's like about 5 hours of total user testing for each release at a minimum, so that we can really have that just consistency of continuing to learn and spending plenty of time in that kind of qualitative experience with our users as we're moving forward on the product cycle. And in terms of finding your users, there's a couple ways to go about it. One is if you have a really tight understanding of a small group of users. So let's say you're building something and you have a community of like 20 users that you're already very, very connected with, then you can pretty easily follow your own instinct on which of that group you should be focusing on learning with and scheduling time with. However, if your user group is a lot broader and you don't have that existing community necessarily built out, then it definitely makes sense to think through a series of questions beforehand to really determine who exactly you want to be speaking with. So if, for example, you're building a product and you have, let's say, 3 or 4 different user personas kind of mapped out, what you want to do in this stage of the preparation is really determine which of those user personas you want to be focusing on for this round of tests. And being able to have those personas defined helps you create those demographic screening questions that can then bring the right people into your kind of test process. So things like your age, background, other demographic questions like that. So once you define who you want to be speaking with, then obviously it's important to actually reach out to folks and begin to schedule times that work for work for everyone. And one note in terms of the outreach to your users after you determine who you want to invite and begin reaching out to them is it's important to really frame as much as possible, frame the context as they should know as little as possible about what it is that you're doing. So if you're building a mobile app, for example, the best case scenario is that the user has never downloaded the app, and downloads it maybe right before the test, but doesn't open it, doesn't create an account. You really want to be able to focus on getting users' first impression, like as immediate as possible. So that framing is really important when you're reaching out to folks. It's like, hey, I'm going to invite you to this test. Here's what we want to do. And your first instinct is the most valuable resource that we can receive. So don't create an account. Don't get into the app. Don't even look at the landing page if possible. So that's one kind of lesson learned there. And then once you have that part of the preparation complete, another aspect is focus on designing the test itself. So really, with the constraint of that 30 to 45 minutes of testing time, our recommendation is you want to ask the user to complete no more than 3 specific tasks, the 3 specific user flows in the course of the test. And the way that we frame the test is really around 2 main elements. One is your framing narrative. And then the second are the key tasks that they're supposed to accomplish. So the framing narrative is like a few sentences of kind of creating a story that you're inviting the user to step into. So that could be something like, okay, so for example, you're someone who's not happy with their current healthcare insurance company and you're planning to change. You read this article about a new health insurance. Here's the article, which includes a link to download the app. You download the app, and then with that framing, we then guide the user into their first key tests. Because we want definitely people to have we want them to share their initial instincts and impulses and reactions, and also we want to give them a bit of direction in terms of the state of mind that we're inviting them to really start the experience with. So that intro narrative is a few sentences of putting that setting that direction from the very beginning, and then in terms of those key tasks, what we want to determine are really within after the end of after shipping a certain release, what are the user flows that are the highest priority that we need to validate are working perfectly. Because obviously when you're building something and then when you're doing your own internal QA, you're figuring out if things work as you expect them to, with the assumptions that you already have going into it. However, there are a lot of assumptions that go into building anything. So being able to really identify what are the core user flows that you want to be making sure are really well understood and obvious for the user, that's really what you want to do in terms of designing the task. And when you are setting up those tasks, what we find is that it's really important to make sure that there's a way to establish whether a task has been validated as complete or not. So saying something like, download the app and learn how it works. Like, that's pretty vague, as opposed to saying, create a new account and send a message to a service provider. Like, send one message to one service provider, as another example, is like a specific task that you can actually quantitatively validate afterwards if the user was able to complete or not. So that's one kind of lens to think about when you're designing your tests. But what effectively, once you have your test structure, your intro narrative, and your 3 key tasks, then the kind of next step is to formalize that into a testing protocol. So we'll mention it at the beginning and we'll link to it at the end. But the framework that we use in our Notion guide and template has this all kind of broken out, so that as you ideate on your testing design, you can then take that input and put it into a specific framework and template that is effectively what you need to hit the ground running, and what you need in front of you on an actual test to be able to feel comfortable and confident that you can go ahead and get started with it. So once that is defined and formalized and good to go, the last step from the preparation phase is running a practice. So that's with yourself, with a team member, with a couple team members, just getting into that flow, getting into that practice of running a test is really helpful. So you definitely want to have at least a couple rounds of that complete by the time you sit down with your first actual user, so that you can feel as comfortable as possible and ultimately make the most of that time, because that's extremely valuable time that your user is giving you. It is extremely valuable information that you can be receiving if you are using that time as well as you can be. So running that practice helps to make sure that you do that. And that's it in terms of the preparation. That's really all you need to get started. The next phase is running the tests themselves. So in terms of some elements that we find that are important for running usability tests, the first is just simply warm-ups. So this is really common in the world of like journalism, where if you're sitting down with a source or an interview, you always want to start your interview with a couple questions like, what did you have for breakfast today? Or what were you up to last weekend? Something really, really light that can help get the user just talking. The most important thing is for them to just feel comfortable explaining whatever's on their mind, because that is the purpose of your time together, is for them to very comfortably be just naming whatever is on their mind. And sometimes users can come in and the framing of like a testing session and feedback and blah, 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 can kind of create this expectation, kind of lift up the expectations where they can feel like, okay, I gotta, say the right thing, or I need to, be professional, or, whatever. And those kind of mental blocks can be filters to keep them from sharing what they actually think and feel. So starting with a couple warm-up questions is really important to just like break down those barriers and allow the conversation to start flowing from the very beginning. And then this is mostly important if you are really focused on highlighting a specific user persona for your testing sessions, but it can be really helpful to get additional psychographic information from your user on top of the demographic information that you already have. So some of the things, like if you're trying to get an understanding of their expertise, for example, you can ask questions like, how often do you, for example, if it's like an e-commerce brand, you can ask questions like, oh, how often do you shop online? Or how confident are you with browsing or shopping or doing other online, related tasks? Or what devices do you usually use for online shopping? Just so you can get a sense of their starting point. Because you have that basic demographic information, but when you're looking at your results, it can be really helpful to have this psychographic layer as well, to be able to make sense of distinguishing like wildly different patterns of feedback. Because some users, might be logging onto, signing onto an app, and be able to immediately understand what they're supposed to do. 1, 2, 3, perfect. They are able to complete their tasks effortlessly. Other users can just be in like endless loops and can get super flustered. Wait, what am I supposed to do? This doesn't make sense. And being able to have a bit more information about each of your users helps in that analysis process, where you can start to be like, oh, of the 20 sessions that we've run, there are these 6 users that had a really, really frustrating experience. And like, oh, look, there's a common pattern of which devices they're using, or what websites they generally shop online with, or whatever. But just giving you a bit more of a lens for your analysis is what you want to be focusing there on. And then after you do your initial warm up and your initial kind of psychographic tests or questions, then obviously it's time for the meet itself, actually running the test. And you already have, as a moderator, you already have your intro narrative ready to go. You already have your key tasks defined. So you have everything you need to get the test started and to keep it on track. The one major call out in the actual running of the test itself that we find to be super important is, as a moderator, to not answer any questions that come up from the user. And you want to be explicit with that at the very beginning, and saying like, hey, what we want is not to be testing you, we want to be testing the product. So anything that comes into your mind, like you think it, you say it. Like that is the most valuable thing that you can be giving us. And what that means is any question that you ask, like, oh, what should happen? I press this and nothing's happening. Why isn't anything happening? That's an extremely important question for us to know. But it's not a question we're going to answer until the very end, if we do at all. And that can be, it can be extremely, extremely difficult when you've spent so much time, you know exactly what is supposed to happen if the user clicks this button. And you know that the button that they're actually wanting to click is right next to it. And if they just click the one right next to it, everything will be working as they expect it to. But again, the most important thing is for you to understand their perspective and their feedback. You want to see the product through their eyes. You don't want to explain the product from your eyes to them, because ultimately the product should be designed where your perspective is baked in to the product experience, and they don't need someone to explain it. So that can be a very challenging thing to maintain, kind of line to maintain, but a really important one. And then the other main call out in terms of running the test itself is that as a moderator, you don't want to be answering any questions. The one thing that you should be doing, though, is asking follow-up questions. And in our guide, we have a whole kind of repository of sample questions that you could be using, but all of them are effectively variations on, that's interesting, tell me more. So that can be something like, I noticed you did blank. Can you tell me why? Or did you notice whether there was any other way to blank? Or can you tell me what you think of blank? Because again, the most important thing for a testing session is just getting as much immediate and honest feedback from your user as possible. So as they're moving along, you definitely want to, ideally, they're just saying exactly what they think. But if there are things that you observe, we're like, oh, that was unexpected, or like, oh, that was really interesting why they did that, and they didn't already explain it, it's super important to just double click there immediately, and then prompt them to name and articulate their thought process. Yeah, so those are, in terms of the test itself, those are some of the key elements that we've learned. And then finally, when you get to the very end of the test, it's always really helpful to have some time to debrief with the user, and just kind of say like, all right, the test is now complete. You've gone through the key tasks that we put in front of you. Really appreciate your time. And now let's end with just a couple overall questions. What was your overall impression of, the app or the app experience? What was the best or worst thing about it? What would you change about it? Really just giving them those last few minutes to take a step back, and kind of summarize and generalize their experience, which you should already have a pretty clear sense of by that point. But it can be really helpful to just get that input, for them to feel kind of complete with the process, and quite frankly, also to get really good marketing copy. I've been surprised by how frequently users that have a really good experience going through a testing session in this debriefing stage just share like brilliant lines of like poetry, where the note taker is like, oh my god, this is amazing, and like being able to just use direct quotes, or make variations on what they say, and add that to your landing page or your social media content, or whatever aspect of your marketing strategy. It's one unexpected kind of outcome of this step. So definitely something to not skip over. But once you're done with the debrief, that's it for the test itself. And after you complete all of your tests for a given round of sessions, then the last stage of the process is around the analysis. What meaning can you make of the feedback that you get? So the way that we do that is first by categorizing the feedback. So you want to review each of the individual pieces of feedback that you got across all of your tests, and assign them to which of the three key tasks, or three-ish key tasks that you requested the user to go through. And then within those tasks, what are the general categories of feedback, so you can start to really begin that grouping process. So if that's like, one of the key tasks is creating a new account, you can have a category around like, the onboarding information, or account update, frustrations, or whatever. But generally, the point is, we have all of this raw data. We want to start grouping it together. And then in addition to grouping the categorization of the feedback, we also want to stack rank the feedback by recurrence, as well as severity. So that's effectively saying that for each of the pieces of feedback, what we want to do is tag it as either a minor, a medium, or a blocking type or piece of feedback. Where a minor, a minor entry is something like the user was slightly hesitant, but then quickly found their own solution. Medium is more the user kind of struggled, but was able to get out on their own. And then blocking is obviously like the user was not able to complete what they wanted to do, or move forward in a given user flow at all. And that is extremely important to be able to call out, because if one person is not able to get past a certain point, if one person is getting blocked, you can generally assume that they are not the only ones and that others will also be getting blocked at the same point. So being able to run that additional lens of really naming the severity for each piece of feedback is also really helpful to kind of just put that lens in your analysis. And here's where you can also be putting some additional qualitative context around the user's state of mind, and adding any comments or quotes that were coming up in that moment. So you can say like, okay, the user was trying to return an item, but they were not able to complete that, and their state of mind was flustered and frustrated and confused. And one of the things they said explicitly was like, I don't know what to do. I probably would just close the app right now, or something like that. All of that information is really, really helpful as the person who's running that analysis, to put into that one entry of feedback, so that when you then bring the results back to your broader team, you can be really clear in communicating to everyone else what the feedback was and where it was coming from, because there's definitely a difference between saying like, hey, dev team or product team or general team that's reviewing this, that's looking at the results of this feedback together. We ran these tests, and the user was, one of the pieces of blocking feedback was that the users were not able to find the return. Like, that's one way to say it, and some people can be like, well, it is obvious, and if they just do blank, then they should get it. But it's a different thing entirely to say, hey, team, we ran these tests, and here was this piece of feedback around users not being able to complete their returns, and here are specific quotes from users, and here is like what we were seeing from their state of mind. That can give a lot more clarity and can give a lot more color to the team to be able to more quickly understand what the problem is and why it's important to then implement a solution. So in terms of your analysis, putting in that additional content context can be really helpful. And then with all of your data kind of fleshed out, then you really have the opportunity to actually run your analysis. And the two ways that we generally go about that are with a round or kind of a lens of quantitative analysis, as well as one round or lens of qualitative. So on the quantitative side, you want to be able to, for each session, name the actual success rate for the key tasks for that user. So if you ask the user to complete three key tasks and they were easily able to complete two, but not the last one, you want to be able to say like, all right, this user had like a 66% success rate, and be very explicit with that. And you also ideally also want to be able to put in qualitative or quantitative detail, like time to complete the task. So like, for task 1, it took 15 minutes to complete. For task 2, it took 3. Again, so you can start to see the patterns that emerge there, which some you might expect, others you might not. And most importantly, you want to be able to see the patterns that you do not expect. So those are some of the elements around the kind of quantitative analysis. And then around the qualitative, what we generally try to do there is just at a really high level start to bring up, what are the different categories of feedback, and what was the general kind of like feeling and state of mind of the users who are coming up against that, who are articulating that feedback. Because if you are looking at your feedback list and you see like, okay, there are 100 different pieces of feedback over the course of 5 different tests, for one category, of feedback, there are 5 entries. For another category, there are 30 entries. Like that gives you a lot of information, and then being able to really determine like, okay, like what are the kind of general qualitative patterns for those, like what meaning can we make, is really important in terms of naming, for any given session, how did it go? Like what's your, leaving the session, what was your perspective of how you think it went overall, what you think the user's experience was overall, and what the individual piece of feedback kind of add up to. And then after you complete your analysis of really calling out the core patterns and the main insights, then you want to really start to go through that prioritization exercise. So you can say like, all right, over the course of this session, a lot of good insights and feedback, but really there's only one thing that's a absolutely must-have priority. And for every session, it's you want to call that out and be really explicit with that. Where from our perspective, you want to definitely call out like any blocking, any piece of feedback that you would tag as blocking level of severity. That would be like number one priority. And then you can also, in the general kind of pattern matching, start to bring up other high frequency patterns as well, in terms of that prioritization. And in terms of how exactly you bring all of that information together, the way that we use it is by effectively filling out a user testing report framework that we create for each session, so that on given looking at any given session, you can see like a really high level perspective of the feedback, qualitative analysis, quantitative analysis, high priority, changes right at the very top. And then if you go into the details, then you can see all the information around the preparation for the test, all the details around the notes, and the kind of like raw data of the test itself. But being able to just have all of that in one place, we find to be really, really helpful. So in terms of like how we bring all of that information together, effectively we create a report for every individual session, and use a pretty defined framework to do that. And I would say that one thing to call out in this process is we generally distinguish the endpoint of a testing session or round of testing sessions as identifying the feedback and identifying problems, as well as identifying patterns for general improvement. What we do not do, and what we kind of where we draw the line, is then ideating solutions. The solution ideation process is generally what we keep within our product development lifecycle. So that's at the beginning of any new release. What we do there is look at our roadmap and see like, okay, what are our previous features we've defined and determined, and also what are the general insights from our previous tests. And those two kind of elements of raw data are our starting point for then determining what we're going to build on any given release. Because if, for example, you run a series of tests and you come up with a few pieces of like some problems that are like, oh, okay, there was a pattern of users having a challenge completing, whatever task, generally, there's not just one way to solve for that. There are a number of different ways that you can solve for any given problem. So being able to say like, okay, we've identified the problems, cool. That's the end of this process, and we'll use those problems as the raw inputs for our solution ideation process, which we keep in our product development cycle. So that's just kind of the benchmarks and frameworks of how we think and how we operate. So just to kind of wrap it all together, at a high level, user testing sessions consist of three main phases of work. One is the preparation, second is the running of the tests themselves, and the third is the analysis of the feedback. On the preparation, what that looks like is, I'm not going to read the slide, but all of those steps. Running the tests themselves, those are the core steps to really keep in mind, and then for your analysis as well. Those are a few different lenses of analysis that we find to be really, really helpful. And as we mentioned before, all of this information is kind of laid out and articulated in a user testing guide that we put together and use for all of the clients that we work with. And that guide includes templatized documents for how to run the tests themselves. It also includes a general outline of the process that we run, as well as a more detailed and kind of in-depth tactical view of the process itself, with, for example, sample questions on pre-screening, psychographic tests, follow-up questions for moderators, all that type of stuff. And then a quick view of like what these actually look like. As we were mentioning before, we create a test report for every session. So that includes like an overall summary, as well as highlighted priority feedback, as well as like every individual piece of feedback from that test. And then all of the kind of raw materials in terms of the preparation, management, and notes from the session itself. That's a kind of quick view of what those reports actually look like. And then we also have keep a database of just all of the individual users that we have conducted sessions with, which are connected, of course, to the sessions that they were a part of. And then it's kind of a framework for how we think of fleshing out each piece of feedback, where we have space for the categorization, tying a piece of feedback to what key test it was a part of, what problem was it, severity, tag, user state of mind, additional comments or quotes, etc. So again, all of the general information we've been talking about over the course of this conversation is all kind of templatized in the structure that we run. And if you want to download it yourself, we'll be putting it up on our website today, where you can just take a look, start using it if it's helpful, take some general feedback or insights or whatever inspiration that you want for your own process, as you like. Best of luck.
That's awesome. Thank you very much for that, Thomas. Very, very good. Do we have time for a few questions, Thomas?
Yeah, definitely. We don't have a hard stop.
So I have a couple of questions first, and then maybe other people. First of all, I mean, obviously, particularly on mobile, it's not quite as easy to share as it would be, for normal sort of web applications, particularly screen sharing. Are there any sort of recommendations you got for the tools to help with, being able to see the user's screen or making sure? I mean, obviously, anything you recommend for people to use for that sort of thing?
Great question. Yeah. So what we found is pretty straightforward, is just using Google Hangouts.
Okay.
On mobile, because Google Hangouts, they can run, if the user has Gmail if the user just has a Gmail app, or if they even just have the Google Calendar app, a Google Hangout can start to run on their mobile. So what we generally ask users to do is schedule them on Google Hangouts, and for the most part, we don't need the users to download a separate app, because they have one of that Google ecosystem, and then can log into the session via Google Hangouts, and then just start sharing their screen on mobile, and then we see everything that they do.
Hangouts lets you share screen on mobile. That's very cool. That's a good tip. Okay. The other quick question was, any recommendations for how to find users? We talked about the numbers of users, but is there a particular way that you look or approach them? Is it random? Is there you try to find users with certain characteristics? What's the sort of approach for, trying to select the people you want to try and talk to?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I'd say that would really depend on your starting point. So are you building with an existing community of direct relationships in your target group, or are you not? So for example, we have worked with one client that is, for the most part, focused on a pretty small group of users, and has a very active and direct kind of weekly relationship with all 50 of them. So from that starting point, it's very clear for us to go through that exercise of determining okay, what is the general profile we're trying to really target as our number one highest priority persona. And then given that persona, we can look at that existing community of relationships and kind of handpick and cherry pick the users that we want to invite. Whereas we've also been working with clients that have, for example, email list of a few thousand people, but no actual direct, one-on-one personal relationships. And again, that's an important exercise to go through, determining what is your highest priority persona in terms of who we should be trying to, run these sessions with. But in that type of context, it's more helpful to send out a general invite with a series of those demographic questions as part of the invitation. So then, let's say if you send it out to a few thousand folks, you get 60 people who say that they're open. You can look at the demographic information for those 60, and then pick out the ones that actually fit with who you're trying to speak with.
Very cool. Okay. Very good. Thank you for that. Right. Is there anybody else that'd like to ask any questions while we're here?
I will.
Very good.
All right, Toby. I think I'll just pick up on that thread. Tomas, good session. This Rajiv. Toby and I working on, he's helping us out on an app that we've been building for some time. So we did a round of testing. So we are approaching this sort of a little micro launches mode, where we did a first round of testing with a few friends and family. I got some feedback in, and we're incorporating that feedback. But we are sort of getting into our next stage of testing. But to your last point about a list, so we are. What's your take on? We're compiling a list of people we don't know, right? So we're a travel app, so we're going to reach out to a lot of creators, bloggers. Then there's a friends and family group. What's the right size incrementally? And with this is all remote. They'll get a test flight link. Are we talking 50, 100, 200? Do you have any thoughts, suggestions?
Got it. In terms of the number of people to run sessions with?
And this is, we're not expecting an online session. We're just going to invite them, and they'll get a link from test flight. But also, do we send them an email for people who don't know us? What's a good approach?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the considerations is just where are you in your development cycle? So for example, with the release that you want them to test, is that a release that you're planning to launch to 1,000 users, 10,000 users, is that a release that already has an existing user base? Kind of where's your starting point right now? And
we don't have a user base, so we are still very, very private. I would call we are in Alpha 2. And then our thought process is Alpha 1, 10, 15 people, Alpha 2, maybe 50 with a cross section of next round of friends and family, and 20 to 30 strangers. And then our goal is to get into sort of still be close, like a private beta with a larger number of people, and lock down that this is what we're going to build and release, what we call a beta launch, which will be on App Store. So we are kind of still, we're still in the building mode. We got a few things to figure out. But what I don't want to do in this round is ask for feedback on features. We don't want to do that. I think we have a pretty good idea. What we want to do is basically see how the experience is, and is it something that they're willing to use? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Cool. Yeah. So with that in mind, I would say that the kind of so the two, kind of taking a step back, in terms of getting feedback for a specific release, being able to get more information is obviously better than less. And as a default, we always want to really get our highest value qualitative feedback from users using the type of sessions that we just talked through. And that can be, from our perspective, like conducting about 5 every release is a solid baseline. At that point, you start to see some patterns. You could do more, if you want to, but again, each of them you would want to block about an hour. So it definitely does add up in terms of time. And if you're doing smaller releases, then you definitely want to balance like time you're spending with users as well as time that you are like actually building and shipping. And I think we generally orient towards shorter releases and like enough feedback to run with, but not kind of just staying in loops of like, okay, we finished this release. Now we need to talk to 100 users, and we can't launch the next one until after we've done this huge exercise, which it could be really helpful if you're operating at a scale where you have like a full UX team and all that stuff. But when you're really just wanting to keep your momentum going, I think 5 is per release is a solid number. And then of course, balancing that qualitative feedback with as much quantitative data as you can get. Because there are obviously a number of different pretty sophisticated analytics tools for any mobile app that you can be using. And also in terms of pre-launch, we find that Google Analytics is just fine.
That's what
in being able to get your basics.
Okay.
Very good. Any other questions from anybody? I think it sounds like we're done, I think. So Thomas, I guess the main thing is, so if anybody wants to be able to sort of use you guys to do these sorts of sessions, this is part of your whole suite of sort of services you provide, right, to help people go through this process. So they definitely tap you up at your DreamLabs.pro website, right? Very good.
Yep. Yeah, cool. DreamLabs.pro.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for the session. That was really interesting. I think hopefully everyone got some stuff from there. Any last words before we sign off?
No, I would say, just the last thing is, so I was mentioning for all of our clients, we run this process after every release. And one thing that we found to be really fun is that we generally, for the first couple times that we do a session, we do feedback sessions, our team will take the lead on moderating the first few times. And then after, whatever founder we're working with has seen, kind of been through the process a couple times, and we'll switch and let them take the lead, and they go ahead with moderating, and we take a step back and help with the note taking and stuff and the analysis. But it is a really fun and terrifying and like really exciting moment when you kind of put your baby out there and then shut your mouth. So just want to name that, for folks that are in that moment and are getting ready for that process, definitely have fun with it. And if you're feeling all the things, that is totally normal and expected. It's super, super important to be doing. So for those who are making the time to run these types of processes, well done, and keep it up.
Very cool. Okay, good stuff. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for turning up, and
thanks.
Looking forward to the next session.
Oui,
Okay, cheers.
Ciao, ciao.